Thank you for Generation Interfaith Coalition for Responsible Investment and our quarterly webinar. You will be put on listen-only mode and until the Q&A section of our webinar. We are particularly delighted today to have with us Laura Germino. She'll be joining us this morning. She is a founding member of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and helped to establish CIW's anti-slavery campaign. I'll say a little bit more about that, but maybe just to kind of set a tone, we'll begin with just a short little reflection. This was actually a prayer that was penned by Cesar Chavez, and might help set the tone for us as we get underway today. Show me the suffering of the most miserable, so I will know my people's plight. Free me to pray for others, for you are present in every person. Help me to take responsibility for my own life, so that I can be free at last. Grant me courage to serve others, for in service there is true life. Give me honesty and patience, so that I can work with other workers. Bring forth song and celebration, so that the Spirit will be alive among us. Let the Spirit flourish and grow, so that we will never tire of the struggle. Let us remember those who have died for justice, for they have given us life. Help us love even those who hate us, so we can change the world. Amen. So, as I was saying earlier, we're delighted to have Laura Germino with us. In addition to establishing Coalition of Immokalee Workers' anti-slavery campaign, she was honored in 2010 by the US State Department as a TIP hero, a trafficking in persons hero. In 2015, the anti-slavery campaign received the Presidential Award for extraordinary efforts in combating modern day slavery. CIW's pioneering worker-based social responsibility model, the Fair Food Program, includes workers in addressing exploitation and abuse and to eradicate modern slavery in Florida's tomato fields. Welcome to our webinar series, Laura. We're so glad to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. It's interesting. Today we're talking about labor trafficking, and which is frequently not, it's not as frequent a topic in the news often as other aspects of human trafficking. But today on Valentine's Day, I don't know if you all saw the press release or the news about a petition filed under the Tariff Act about addressing the importation of cocoa for chocolate, our Valentine's chocolates, which is cocoa often harvested by child labor and children who are trafficked for labor in those cocoa plantations. So anyone who is interested, it's all over the news right now, and it's a reminder of how forced labor trafficking is in not just the produce here in the US or the clothes that we wear, but in every aspect of our lives, even unfortunately in Valentine's Day chocolates. And
our gifts will taste just a little more bitter than usual today.
Well, and I'm not necessarily, I do know there are alternatives like Tony's Chocolonely, which is not what we're talking about today, but that is one of the most effective ones in being really serious about it. We're going to talk about how a program that we devised to eliminate labor trafficking on farms in the US and how it could be spread elsewhere as well, and what we had to do to get there. I wondered if we could put up the map.
Yes.
Yeah. And this map is, we're based in Immokalee, Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a human rights organization dedicated to originally improving the wages, working conditions of farm workers in Immokalee at that time. However, that was 25 years ago. 25 years later, we have a program that I think many people listening to this webinar have already heard of, but it covers now, it's based, our center was Immokalee, but it has now spread into many different states across the Southeast where the tomato harvest is, and as well in peppers, and other crops are being added as we speak. And we have a sister program in Vermont of dairy workers who milk the cows for Ben & Jerry's ice cream, for example, the Milk for Dignity program. What is this program? It's a program where that has virtually eliminated labor trafficking and sexual violence on the farms participating in the program. Now you can see there, it's where you see the points of light and the lighter green, that's where this new day has really taken hold since 2011. And yet outside of that, on non-fair food program farms, the things we were running into in the early 90s are not yet being prevented. On the fair food program farms, we've reached a level of prevention. So I wanted to show first a short video. The CNN Freedom Project came down to our organization in Immokalee, where most of the farm workers in Immokalee are from, immigrated here from Mexico, Guatemala, Haiti, and then you also have US citizens continuing to harvest and farm work. Many are immigrants. And I wanted to talk about a little bit, as we discuss this, the nexus between migration and trafficking, labor trafficking. And the Freedom Project came down. They had been used to filming on issues of forced labor or modern day slavery, labor trafficking internationally. And then after several years of filming this, they came down to Immokalee to show how it's being prevented. And they have interviewed a woman named Alejandrina, who was both in Immokalee during those darker earlier years when the abuses were rampant, and she's now a participant in the Fair Food Program. And I think this piece will go a long ways in illustrating the changes that have come about.
Okay.
And we'll see if everyone can hear it.
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey! Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
The most
important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amaryl Walker, CNN.
Okay. There.
I don't know about everyone else seeing that, and I hope everyone could hear it, but to hear Alejandrina's story after a quarter century of working and what was going on when we first started is just incredibly encouraging. And we talk a lot about the abuses that happen, but this is something that's actually very good news. And I wanted to point out something. When Alejandrina says we're no longer forced to work, for a lot of people listening who aren't familiar with labor trafficking, I mean listening to the show in general, not this audience, but forced to work, they may think that means forced to do tasks at work that they don't particularly enjoy, but she means literally not forced to work as in work against your will, with an employer who, through violence or threats of violence, prevents you from leaving because you fear for your life. So that one comment means something very different in the context of agriculture and a lot of other low-wage industries than it would to say someone just hearing it. She means it literally, that we're no longer forced to work. I wanted to show, and by the way, I did want to say, when I was just watching it again, I hear something different every time. John Esforms, who is the farmer that you heard, the grower, who was the first to step forward to participate in the Fair Food program. He said something about, agriculture's always been a place where there have been terrible things happening. And it just made me remember, particularly given the participants in this webinar, if you think about the book of Ruth, and when Naomi goes out to glean in the fields, what's the first thing that she gets told? Don't be by yourself. Stay close to, I think it was her, you all know this better than I, but her family member. And it's basically discussing the vulnerability that a woman would have in the fields to sexual harassment. And that's how long, that's why when we talk about people saying that this is a safe and happy place for them to work in agriculture, it is revolutionary even beyond our immediate history, but it's been the fact that it is transformative, and it just shows how far back that goes. So it just something that occurred when I was listening to John talking just now. What is it, how were the conditions that she refers to a little bit, she refers to in brief in this piece? When we started working in the early 90s to improve the labor conditions, human condition in the fields in agriculture, we didn't start out to be an anti-slavery organization or anti-human trafficking organization. In the early 90s, that whole very much needed national movement to provide appropriate help and services to victims of human trafficking there wasn't that network. In fact, a lot of our work was pioneering that helped lead to that network. And when we first started out, therefore, when we encountered one of our earliest labor trafficking operations, which ended up being a federal case called US versus Miguel Flores, this was in the early 90s, we didn't realize exactly what was going on at that point. Even even after the prosecution, at that time, we didn't fully realize that we thought maybe it was just one particularly like an unusual situation. And then, but after, that was resolved in 1997. In 1999, we had another case and another, and after a while, it became clear that this was actually, unfortunately, something that happened to not everybody, not the majority of workers, but to an all significant, percentage of workers were being held against their will at any given time on certain farms. We first began looking into this case in 1991 or 92 when it was brought to our attention by workers who had heard that there were things going on in the camp. And when we say a Florida case or a South Carolina case, all these labor trafficking cases that we talk about tend to occur in multi-states, so Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, because you follow the harvest, and involving many workers. So this one involved 500 workers at a time. And I wanted to show a local news clip from the early 90s that not only shows the community who runs into these cases, sometimes without knowing it, the local community, and also the role that the faith-based people can end up playing in a case like this. It shows up in this news clip. But what it was is it involved a crew leader named Miguel Flores. A crew leader is the overseer, is the supervisor on a farm that manages the labor. And he had workers on labor camps, which are on farms, where he had armed guards, ensuring that if people left, they would be beaten, pistol whipped. The women were sexually assaulted. And it was one of the more violent operations that we had run into over the years. And I just wanted to show this news clip that's just 3 minutes long. Again, I hope everybody's able to hear this audio.
Slavery in this country was officially abolished after the Civil War, and a lot of us think that that was the end of it, but apparently it was not.
A Southwest Florida man is being sentenced later this month on the unusual charge of enslavement. Wake News reporter Valerie Boy talked to some farm workers who say that it was and still is being practiced here in Southwest Florida.
It's a secluded area 90 miles west of Charleston, South Carolina. It's called the Manning Compound. It's also known as a slave camp, that according to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The camp was run by this man, Miguel Flores.
He hit the people, he took out a lot of money out of their paychecks, and there was a lot of problems there. Because at that camp, he forced people to work. When you would get a little bit tired, because it's picking by the piece, he would come out and start shooting his pistol up in the air and telling you to keep hurrying up.
It may seem very far away, but don't be fooled, because many workers say it also happened here in Southwest Florida, in the quiet little town of LaBelle. This man used to work for Flores. He does not want to be identified for fear of retaliation. We'll call him Bill.
He would send men called coyotes into South America, whether it be Guatemala or Mexico. They would bring a number anywhere from 15 to 20 people at a time, and he would charge the pickers anywhere from $700 to $800 a piece to work here.
And when they arrived, they stayed in trailers like these. Real estate agent Larry Spencer says Flores would sometimes rent 18 trailers at a time.
He always paid up front. He would come into town, he would get whatever trailers you needed, which was usually a lot, and then he'd get them, we'd have them ready, and he'd bring his people in. And
Bill says the crew leader would deduct the money out of their paychecks.
Probably if they made $200 in a week, he'd probably take $100 of it.
And if the workers tried to leave before paying off the debt,
I've seen him actually pull a firearm and go looking for somebody that had threatened to leave.
another man who used to work for Flores says his brother's trailer got shot at after having an argument with the crew leader because Flores refused to pay him. Now, even though this trailer is under renovation, you could still see some of the marks left by the bullets. So why didn't the authorities put a stop to this?
Who's going to call the cops? These workers, they're illegal.
The growers say they weren't aware of the situation.
Every once in a while, there's people that come along, like Miguel, that we need to identify in the system and eliminate them from being able to harvest.
Farm worker Alberto Guzman says the conviction of Flores is a landmark victory.
I would like it to be an example for everyone else so that all these other crew leaders will finally get themselves in shape and behave in the right manner.
And Miguel Flores did not respond to our request for an interview, and his attorney did not want to comment. Prosecutors say Flores worked in Southwest Florida from the mid-'80s up until May of 1996. He'll be sentenced for the slavery charges on November 14th in Charleston, South Carolina.
Now, the interesting thing about that case is that actually the Catholic Church played a key role in bringing the trafficker to justice. I don't know if some of you all may remember this, but one of the key parts is that these labor camps were isolated in South Carolina on the farm at the end of something called Landfill Road, and so not an attractive area. And if anyone were to go by, for example, back in those days, vans would come by to peddle wares because farm workers don't have cars, they couldn't go anywhere. They would, Miguel Flores and others would shoot up the cars that would come by in order to make them leave and not come in. The only person who was allowed any kind of access was the priest in South Carolina, the local priest. And he was able to get on and try and help people somewhat. And he actually was one of the people who was able to help one of the women escape. And at that point, he bought her a bus ticket, clothes, and a bus ticket to Mexico. And back in those days, you know, the whole network and awareness and education, people weren't aware of fully of the fact that you could contact federal authorities, offer people the option of telling your story to agents that work exactly on eliminating those operations and then helping the rest of the people get off the camp as well. And out of that one case, you know, the way that we were able to get onto the camp to even be able to see the situation was only when the priest took us on there. And that prosecution wouldn't have happened without the role of the faith-based, a very brave person, because it was a situation that was not without risk. This has focused on, you're seeing a lot of immigrant workers so far in these videos, and That is because the workforce nowadays is mostly immigrant. So of course, those who are victims of human trafficking or labor trafficking are mostly immigrant. But the workforce, whether it be immigrant, citizen, guest worker, there has always been, we have run into labor trafficking operations and prosecutions that we've helped with, regardless of your citizenship status. And so I wanted to also show a situation where American citizens were being taken advantage of by a trafficker who operated for over, from the late 80s until 2007, recruiting specifically from homeless shelters throughout the Southeast, say Birmingham, Montgomery, New Orleans, Tampa, Orlando, Miami. And he would prey on people who were trying, either substance abusers or recovering from substance abuse. So he'd go to substance abuse recovery centers, for example. A faith-based place called Touching Miami with Love actually first told us about one of the situations where that he would recruit workers and say, I'm gonna offer you a job and a roof over your head. Well, that's a very attractive prospect to homeless people. That's exactly what homeless people would like, a job and a roof over their heads. And he would get them into the van, promise them motel-like housing up in North Florida and the Carolinas. Well, it was not motel-like housing. It was a labor camp with an 8-foot fence topped by barbed wire and a no trespassing sign. And then he would begin paying them in crack cocaine and alcohol in order to pull them back into their addiction or have them go in even deeper. That case was US versus Ron Evans. He's currently serving 30 years in federal prison. We began looking into it in 2004. And then in 2007, he was sentenced. And there's a very short interview with a man named Joel Goodman, Mr. Joel Goodman, who worked for Ron Evans. He's an American citizen. It's subtitled, it's only 2 minutes long. And it goes by very quickly, but he has a lot to say. And I hope that people I'm really hoping people can hear it and see the subtitles.
1,000 modern slaves have been freed in Florida since 1997. In that time, there have been 6 cases against contractors holding field workers against their will. In Hastings, Florida, 57-year-old Joel Goodman was enslaved by Ron Evans, who is now serving 30 years in federal prison.
I was at Ron Evans camp for 8 years. Well, I thought it was a prison camp when I first seen it. That's what I thought it was. He had his henchmen there, just in case that you trying to run away. Well, I had seen him take the guys and rough them up pretty bad. Pretty bad. Bring them back, man, be terrible looking. You know, when I first got there to his camp, he was telling us, well, you see these shoes, my shoe got blood on them. He said, you understand what I say? My shoes got blood on them. You get any more money, and you trying to run off, we'll find you. Back in slavery time, that's what he think it was to us. It was hard like you prison, you know, but you just couldn't go where you want to go. Oh yes, I was afraid. I was really scared. I really was. Really scared of that camp.
In 2005, the Evans camp was raided by the Department of Justice. They found Evans was deducting rent, food, drugs, and alcohol from workers' pay, leaving them immediately and perpetually in debt. He was charged with human trafficking, drug conspiracy, and financial restructuring.
I never saw any money, you know. Okay, when payday come, there wouldn't be no money at all, and stuff like that. You don't see no money. You see dry pockets. Oh yeah, that was a hard, hard life that I went through. Scuffle life. Man, it was terrible. Yep, terrible life.
Well, you see there that this was happening in 2007. And as he said, to him, it was a slave camp, is how he put it. And I wanted to show you, to give an indication of how transformative it is that in this industry, and it can be applied to other industries, that labor trafficking is no longer happening. If I'm not sure, maybe later you can look at this closer if you can't see it well, but I can walk you through this. The map above, the gray one without the modern roadmap of Palatka, just to spin that one for a minute and look at this background one. That is a map from the 1700s of British slave plantations in Florida. And it was hanging in the British Museum as part of a display of the 200th anniversary of the ending of the British slave trade. And we were over there in England. This was while the Ron Evans case was still ongoing, and another case was happening involving workers who were locked in a U-Haul truck, windowless truck. They were Mexican immigrants. So we had two different cases going on. And we were looking at this map and seeing that we were figuring out that, look, oh, this old map from the 1700s is actually the St. Johns River in Florida. And we could see that, you could see St. Augustine on this old map. And there is a marker on the bend of the river there that says Raleigh Plantation. And it explained that there was a plantation of 300 African slaves and indentured servants from England on that bend in the river in what is now present day Florida, back in the 1700s, the Raleigh Plantation, R-O-L-L-E. Well, as we looked at it, we realized that it was modern day St. John's River, and that the Ron Evans camp, which was in Palatka, Florida, was on that very same bend in the river where he had been holding, Ron Evans, the 60 to 100 workers, homeless workers who he had trafficked there. That 300 years later, there was a modern day slavery operation in that very same soil, the very same spot. So there's basically 300 years of violence and blood in that soil. And it hit us then that for a long time, and I know this means we're slow to figure things out sometimes, but we had thought, when we talked about modern day slavery or forced labor, labor trafficking, that it had made a resurgence in the sense that, oh, here is this, we're still dealing with this, it has come back. But what it really was is that it never stopped. So the key is, like with any law, if you say something that is illegal, it doesn't mean that people stop doing it. Otherwise, there would be no crime, right? And clearly, when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, yes, it brought an end to chattel slavery. It brought an end to plantation slavery, that very worst legally sanctioned, government-sanctioned form of slavery. But what happened was, after that, forced labor morphed into different forms in the US. So right after the war, you had convict leasing, the Civil War, where states would lease convicts to farms and factories to work against their will. Then you had debt bondage in terms of the company store that a lot of people have heard of, where you end up owing your soul to the company store. And that's still going on, and that form still goes on in farm work too, where you owe for transport and food and rent and housing. And so that it became very clear that this just brings home that when we finally, through the mechanisms of the Fair Food Program, through these signed agreements with growers and corporate buyers, we reached a level of prevention where it's no longer that you're helping victims in the best way possible, but getting to a world without victims. It shows how very transformative it is. Because sometimes to the general public or to the media, if you say, oh, there's no longer labor trafficking or modern day slavery in agriculture or in the other industries that we're being asked to adapt our model to. People may think, well, didn't that stop a long time ago? But this just brings home how genuinely unusual it is that it's finally on these farms, it is a new day, because outside of these farms, we still have work to do, and in other low-wage industries.
If I may, it seems that part of the shift then is in coming at a new day is also with developing the trust of the farm workers, of the growers, of the retailers. Maybe we could talk a little bit about gaining that trust, and also what brings about that new day.
Well, it's and I know we want to leave time for questions too, but it's exactly this Fair Food program is everyone, in terms of it's a win-win-win for workers, suppliers, in this case the growers, and the corporate buyers. Because the key was here, consumers, including faith-based consumers, many students as well, saying, you know, a criminal prosecution where you put, say, a Miguel Flores in jail, it cleans up an abuse after it already happened, and you would rather it not happen in the first place, right? But it also does not touch the issue of who's actually, where's that produce actually going? And when consumers started asking, along with workers, asking corporate buyers, can you assure us that there aren't abuses in these tomatoes that you're using in, you know, your tacos or hamburgers or supermarkets? Because we have 14 corporate buyers on board. What people wanted to do, realized, and some came willingly, others, you know, took a little bit longer to see why it would be necessary to want to prevent these abuses from happening in the supply chain. But what happens is, after people join the program, meaning buyers and growers, they realize the value of, on a moral level, of having a happy and humane workplace, but also in terms of it's good for business, in terms of risk management, in terms of vastly reducing worker turnover, you know, turnover of your workforce, in terms of being an employer of choice, which was a totally new concept in farm work. And so you saw this industry go from one of the most regressive to the most progressive. And it was through these signed agreements with the corporate buyers that involve market-based consequences. Now, what does that mean? It means if there is a zero tolerance policy violation of the code of conduct, and it's a code of conduct developed by the workers, so it's not developed by the corporation, which, as you all know, for corporate social responsibility, it may be well-meaning, but it was really about public relations more about PR than HR, I would say. And what you have instead is workers developing the code of conduct based on their specific reality. And then how do you get that code of conduct to be genuinely respected and not just be words on paper? There's effective enforcement with teeth, meaning market-based consequences. If there is a zero tolerance violation, and that would be slavery, forced labor, labor trafficking, sexual violence, that occurs on the supplier's fields or factory or wherever you apply this approach, then they cease to purchase from that supplier. And that has a very, you know, effective way of having people focus on knowing what's going on in the workplace and implementing this prevention through agreeing to participate in third-party monitoring, which isn't just any third-party monitoring. It involves workers from the worker organization, Coalition of Immokalee Workers, going on to the fields and educating other workers about their rights so that they can become monitors of their rights. There is a prohibition of retaliation for bringing a complaint. So one of your rights under the code of conduct is the right not to be retaliated against. If the supplier were to retaliate, well, again, the buyers cease to purchase from you. Now, these are all correctable. It's not something that happens immediately in terms of corrective action plan. If there's a violation that's not one of the most egregious, you correct it. And in the same, and the monitors, which is the Fair Food Standards Council, which is headed up by a former New York State Supreme Court Justice. And the auditors go out there, and in terms of sampling size, they talk to over 50% of the workforce every time they do an audit, which isn't just a difference in, there's audits which are just snapshots or check the box audits. This is a whole different word. In fact, I wish there were a different word for this kind of audit, because it's actually different in, not just in degree, but in kind. And monitoring, so as a worker, if there is something you need to complain about, there's many ways you can do so. You can do so through telling the workers who come on to educate you about your rights, come on to the farms. You could tell the company's HR department, because now many of the farms which didn't have HR now do, or you could tell the Fair Food Standards Council. So that is the basic outline of the Fair Food Program, which is the proof of concept, really, that the approach that we developed works. And this is a lot of information at once, I know, but the alternative to CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, we have called worker-driven social responsibility, WSR, of which our Fair Food Program is a very clear, model of.
Can you say a little bit more about the expansion of that into like other commodities and other industries?
Well, it started out in tomatoes in Florida, and then now it's in, as you saw on that map at the beginning, a lot of different states, and peppers, and then the sister program in dairy. But as we speak, it's getting expanded into other row crops and more states as well. We are getting many requests for adaptations in other industries and in other countries as well. And a lot of these, we'll have more news in a few weeks, but, and it's also being adapted to Lesotho, which is a small country in Southern Africa, in the garment industry, specifically addressing prevention of sexual violence in the factories there. So really the potential is limitless. We're also working with the National Model Alliance, which is in the fashion industry, because the models also see the value of a similar program in terms of third-party monitoring, prevention of abuses, a code of conduct developed by the workers, in that case, the models themselves. I know there's a lot. It's a very exciting time in the sense that there's a solution, because there's a lot of data. If you want to look at the fairfoodprogram.org, we have these reports that go into exactly the progress that has been made, the complaints that have been resolved, the dropping in level of abuses, in terms of the incidents, the frequency of what happens. And it's now just a matter of having buyers see that this is something that there's no need to have workers right now suffering abuses in the supply chain. If you would apply the concepts of market-based consequences and worker participation in the code of conduct and in monitoring. And there are corporate buyers who are still future partners. We have 14 on board now in agriculture, 15, I think, like Walmart, McDonald's, Trader Joe's, Burger King, basically fast food, supermarkets, and food service. Wendy's is not yet on board. They're what we call a future partner. And so the campaign is ongoing. But at this point, the good thing is that there are corporations and suppliers who are coming forward saying, we want to do this, without having consumers, many of them faith-based consumers, have to spend that time, bringing it to their attention in a vocal way.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Maybe what we can do is invite folks to unmute themselves if they want to offer some questions. And just to know too, after this webinar, I'll provide a list of some of the websites that Laura's referenced, and also links to some of the videos. And feel free to offer it.
So Chris, participants can unmute themselves if they have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Laura, it's Dan Trado in Milwaukee. I have a question regarding the number of people now in the industry. How many would you say are what's the number of workers that you're involved with?
In terms of, at this point, for the tomato
agriculture, yeah.
Probably it's touched hundreds of thousands of workers but I'd say at any given time, 35,000 positions. Wow. And then I can't tell you, my colleagues would have to tell you what it was in the dairy situation, and also in the program that's being implemented in Lesotho. But it was 90% of the industry, the growers who came forward back in 2011. It started out with that one gentleman you saw, John S. Forms, the grower who stepped forward, and then Lippman, who was also one of the first visionaries, and then everybody else joined on shortly after.
And you've been in this long enough. What's the difference now between the current administration and the flow of immigrants to get the work done?
Yeah, we are seeing more guest workers who are also covered by our program. And one of the things is that we needed to, if you are in the Fair Food program, we actually have what's called a clean stream set up, a little bit similar to what Canada does, because we couldn't have the Fair Food program with the violations that go on in recruitment with private recruiters in Mexico. So with the Fair Food program, we asked the workers, and the workers in Mexico said that there's a Mexican employment service, it's called SNE, it's a government office, who they said would be a reliable agency. And that is who workers apply to in order to come here.
Thank Laura, you. This is Frank Sherman. Maybe a broader question, maybe you can answer, or Chris. How prevalent, if you look across the whole ag sector in the US, how prevalent are immigrants and migrant workers across the ag sector on the farm level?
Just like the other low-wage industries, like say construction or garment, either immigrants or guest workers. Remember, guest workers they're foreign born, but they're not immigrant in that they can't, it's a type of visa that doesn't allow you to adjust your status.
Can't stay.
Right, which is a whole nother story in itself. It says you only can work with one employer. So inherently right there, we do see trafficking with guest workers because it's already set up where the employer has a lot of control. I'm not saying everybody, but of those who want to take advantage, that's another way. But, well, the farm sector is probably, it's heavily immigrant, 90% probably. I don't want to say the wrong percentage, but it is the vast majority at this point in time. Immigrant and guest worker, so.
And how many of those are undocumented? And I know that that's obviously not a hard number, but based on your experience and analysis.
Well, it's the guest workers all have visas. So they are not undocumented just by virtue of being a guest worker. And then it's a mix, it really is, because we've had cases involving undocumented workers, there's workers who have political asylum, workers with resident alien cards, green cards, and US citizens, but it's a mix.
Hello, Laura. This is Lisa Lundgren from USCCB. Do you happen to know why Wendy's has been resistant to joining on with the Fair Food Program, since so many of their competitors have joined, like McDonald's, for example?
Well, that is just the $64,000 question. That's the exact question a lot of people have been asking them. And we have our next action is March 10th through 12th in New York City. But at this point, there's really no rational justification for not joining. We have seen that it's interesting, because some of our partners, for example, you'll have a partner who, Taco Bell was a 4-year boycott, right? And then you had Walmart come on without any campaign whatsoever, right? But of those who had to respond to a consumers and workers campaign, oftentimes it's after the fact that they'll say, well, I don't know what we were so concerned about. But they will refer to a mentality that isn't really an economic rationale, but it's basically like, we don't want to be told what to do. And we don't want to disrupt. A lot of it is this fear of disrupting your supply chain, because it's set up and it would be work to change your supply chain, if you had to. It's really a question that we've asked ourselves a lot. So it's something that we wonder as well, but it's probably the same rationale that anyone who took a while to join, but now joined and is now, one of the fans of the program it's the same idea, just not wanting to be told what to do.
You want to say, maybe a question also would be, as shareholders working with companies, we're eager to see them adopt this model in all kinds of areas. But you've been able to work in tomatoes and kind of slowly moving into some of the other areas. You want to say something about maybe some of the challenges of why we can't just today kind of put it in place across everything that's out there?
Because we scaled up right away in 2011. There were 2 growers that came forward, and then all of a sudden it was 90% of the industry. And it's a huge industry because, for example, Florida winter tomatoes, that's 90% of the tomatoes in the US, and for consumption, in terms of not for pizza sauces and so forth, but for, that you eat in tacos and burgers and in your salads and so forth. And right away, we had to be sure that we were launching programs where the auditing and monitoring is done thoroughly, and every complaint is followed up on, and everything is not at a superficial level. So we want to scale up and have it be real, and have it be where it's being done not on the surface, but actually where that transformative change is happening. So we are careful about what we do, but we're definitely in full-blown expansion mode right now, which is a good thing. I wanted the person who was asking about Wendy's, if they wanted, there's a lot of information right now on what's going on with that other of my colleagues I could put them in touch with people who are working specifically in that area.
Yeah. How about another question?
Yeah, this is Sister Judy in Iowa, and I'm wondering how you expanded to other states with tomato workers. I'm thinking of sweet potato industry in Mississippi. It's all done by guest workers or undocumented people. And so how did you get other states? Did you go through the farmers, or did you have people going out from your group?
Well, that's an excellent question, because what happened was in terms of the states that you see above Florida there, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, when the growers had the Fair Food Program in Florida, once people, those same workers, a lot of these corporate growers have land leased up and down the East Coast and through the Southeast to Tennessee and other states, it's that you have to provide produce year round to fast food restaurants or supermarkets nowadays, right? So you have, they may be Florida based, but they operate in all of those states. So the quickest one was when workers would cross a state line, and it didn't last very long when they were told that, oh, never mind, the Fair Food Program protections and premium don't apply once you cross the border. It just wasn't going to be tenable, because if you had this system of people understood now what it was like to be in a progressive workplace, and they weren't going to just accept changing it once they crossed that state line. So now those states, a lot of that is the same companies that are owning or leasing land in those states that they were working for in Florida. Does that make sense? And also, we've had, some of it depends on people coming to us. Like we're working on an effort right now in Texas in a different crop. And that was because the corporate buyers have said, we really need to expand this. We don't feel like we're genuinely preventing things with any other program. So we've had the buyers ask for that. And I wanted to address the sweet potato issue. It's interesting you said that, because that crop was the one in the US versus Ron Evans case. That was, it was potatoes and cabbages in Florida, but it was sweet potatoes in North Carolina. And it would be a matter of, it's really that it would be usually, so far it's been either a grower or a buyer or even a country saying, meaning the government of a different country like Chile, saying, can you come and start working on how we could adapt this program in this area. Right now, Walmart is, there's details that'll be clearer later. So
things you can't say right now because of ongoing negotiations, which we'll try and keep people abreast of. We're coming to the top of the hour, so we need to draw this to a close. But want to say, first of all, again, that we'll be sharing links to the slides, to the videos, and we'll also send links to the different websites that were mentioned. And especially, though, really want to thank Laura for visiting with us today, and for all of our participants, for your active listening and for your questions. And again, this webinar, the recording will be posted on our website, seventhgenerationinterfaith.org. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Laura.
Thank you.